I'm Michael Figueroa, Vice President of Operations at OAGi, and today we are going to talk all about OAGIS 10 verbs. When we decided we were going to do this webinar, I got pretty excited because I realized this was an opportunity to remove some of the confusion and possibly even frustration that I experienced and share that knowledge with everyone else. I've always had the opinion that of all of the various things that one needs to understand and remember about the OAGIS specification and standard, the verbs, for me at least, were kind of the difficult one in terms of memory. I have found myself over the years occasionally scratching my head, saying, "Oh, which verb do I use for this particular implementation? And what's the difference between notify and sync?" And just trying to keep all of that knowledge in your head at one time can be a little daunting at first. And so over the years, I've put together a kind of a mental technique to remember all of the various verbs and when to use them and implement them. So that's what I'll be sharing with you on this webinar. And hopefully at the end, you'll have a little more confidence with the use of verbs, and a little bit of that fog of war, so to speak, will be removed. So verbs, this is a basic view of our OAGIS BOD, which is a business object document. It has an application area at the top. There is another webinar that discusses that. But for the most part, all of our nouns and all of our BODs are comprised of verbs and nouns used in combination. Here is the list of all 16 of our verbs. There's a lot of them there. And we're going to walk through each one of these verbs throughout this presentation. The one that you will not see used again or mentioned again is the confirm verb. The confirm is used for a very specific purpose. It is used for the confirm BOD, which is a low-level functional acknowledgement. And we'll actually be having a webinar later that discusses only the confirm BOD because it has a kind of a highly special usage. These verbs are used in combination with nouns to imitate common business patterns for business transactions and business processes. What do I mean by pattern? Let's take a look at this customer party, supplier party. This is kind of a very typical supply chain or ERP process between two parties that are doing business together. We have a process purchase order going across the top, which elicits from the supplier a response message coming back that says they acknowledge the purchase order. They have received that purchase order and are processing it. Later, the supplier party, when they fulfill the order, they will send a notify shipment to the customer party. So we're going back from the right-hand side to the left. And when that package actually arrives on their doorstep, the customer party may choose to send a notified delivery receipt back to the supplier saying, "I have received the goods, everything is in order." The supplier party will then send a process invoice back to the customer party. And finally, in some cases, the customer party can send back an acknowledge invoice. I got your invoice, and the transaction is now complete. So here's all of our verbs, and this is what I sometimes tell people to print this out and post it to your wall at work if you're working with OAGIS heavily, and these are verbs that you're going to have to understand. So this is your cheat sheet. Print this out, stick it to the wall, and I'm going to break this down so that it's not quite as intimidating as it looks right here. There's a lot of verbs here, and there's a lot to understand, but I'm going to make it so that you know which verbs to focus on the most. So let's break it down by looking at just the left column here. The left column is the message verb that what I like to call the transaction initializer. So we go from process, post, change, cancel, sync, load, get, and notify. All of those 8 verbs generally initialize some sort of transaction. And now we're going to go to the second column, where we'll find 7 transaction responders. These are the verbs that respond to the message initializer or transaction initializers on the left-hand column. So we have an acknowledge, post acknowledge, change acknowledge, cancel acknowledge, sync response, load response, and show. And we can break this down even further. Let's go to the next slide and talk about some verbs that you're probably not going to use. On the left, you see post and load. These were requested by the financial institutions, banks, etc., people that work with financial processes. Those organizations have to adhere to very specific details, and those details made them come to us and say, we have to have a post and we have to have a load. And so unless you're in a financial institution or a financial environment of business processes, you're probably never going to use the post and load. So you can kind of mark those verbs as, something you're never going to touch. The same holds true for the verb response. The post acknowledge and the load response are responses to the post and load. And so if you're not in financial business processes, you're never going to use these verbs. Next, we'll talk about the sync and notify. These are two verbs that are often confused. Years ago, I used to confuse them myself all the time. And the easiest way to remember when to use these is based on the verb response. The notify has no response. So it's basically kind of a fire and forget, if you will. It's a transaction that says, hey, this happened in my system, and anyone who wants to know about it, here's my signal. It's almost like a beacon. You're just saying, hey, an event occurred, and here's the notification message that the world gets to read and process, so that they're aware that that took place. What if you want to do a synchronization between two systems? In other words, I've got a database on one hand, and I've got a database number two on the other side of my enterprise, and those two systems have to remain in sync. Just remember the word sync. That's your answer. The sync verb is used to keep two systems in synchronization. So when an event occurs in one, that message, that transaction is synced over using the sync verb. So let's take a hypothetical situation here. The purchase order lands in the system A. Well, then that system A needs to be synced with system B. So they send a sync purchase order over to system B. When it arrives, and this is optional, if it's imperative that those systems remain in sync, the system B can then send over a sync response verb back to system A. So we've covered notify. That's a fire and forget. Sync is keeping two systems in sync. And now we're going to talk about acknowledgments. Process can receive a response, and the response is acknowledged. So let's go back to purchase order. System A sends a process purchase order to system B. System B receives it, sends back an acknowledged purchase order message. That's the verb coming back. What if, let's use a real world example here. Let's say someone's placing a purchase order, and they are at the data entry screen, and they order one vehicle. And they punch in the number one, but they're in a hurry, and they fat fingered the keyboard, and in typing the number one, they accidentally typed the number two as well. So now instead of ordering one vehicle, they've ordered 12 vehicles. And they hit submit, and off goes a process purchase order from system A to system B. System B receives it and sees that the process purchase order amount is for the amount of one vehicle, but the quantity is 12. They can send back and acknowledge, and this would be an example of some advanced, very nimble, very intelligent systems. They can send back an acknowledge process, an acknowledge purchase order, and tell the system A, the sending system, hey, there's an issue with your purchase order. The quantity and the amount do not match up. Or they make a phone call like we've done for decades, and they say, hey, you sent this purchase order, but it's got issues. And the person goes into their system and says, oh, well, I can't change it. So let's go ahead and cancel that purchase order. And they get into the system, cancel it, and it sends a cancel purchase order over to from system A to system B. System B now says, okay, I've got it, and they have the option of sending back a cancel acknowledge. I did receive your cancel, and it is canceled. We don't have to worry about the purchase order. It's not going to be fulfilled. Or scenario 3, they get the phone call and they say, oh, you know what? Let me go ahead and change that. And they go back into their system and they say, yep, you're right. I did accidentally press the number 2, so it's 12. I'm changing that to the number 1. They hit enter, and from system A, off goes a change purchase order. So they change the 12 to a 1, hit enter, off goes a change purchase order, and the receiving system B can send back a change acknowledge, signifying that they did receive it and the change is valid and everything is well with the world again. So those are acknowledgements, and now we're going to talk about kind of the common actors. What do I mean by common actor? These are the ones that you're probably going to use the most. That's not to say that the notify isn't an important verb to remember, or that the sync and sync response verb combination isn't something you'll see in an enterprise, but these are the ones you'll use the most often. And personally, we've already covered what notify does, and we've covered what sync and sync response are used for, to keep two systems in sync. And for that reason, I've kind of grayed them out. Even though they are kind of common, they're not as common as the process and the acknowledge, and they're not quite as common as the change and change acknowledge and cancels. So if you can remember these 4 combinations here, you're probably in really good shape to talk in the boardrooms with the business analysts and the implementers. Get and show at the bottom there are really handy for web API. And what I mean by that is the browser sends a GET request, or the system A sends a GET request to some sort of web service or a RESTful service. And that GET might say something like, I want to see all of the purchase orders you have for this time period, or I want to see the top 100 purchase orders that have occurred this week. And the web API will respond with a show verb coming back. So get and show are really easy to remember. It's basically a request response, very typical of stuff we see over the web and over well, any system, really, any environment, really. You can do get and show over FTP if you wanted to, but they're most commonly used on the web. So all of our BODs in the OAGIS standard are all the same in terms. What I mean by that is, if you open up process purchase order and you open up sync purchase order, the BODs are identical with one exception. The verb itself changes. So if you were to extend this bill of materials at the bottom there and hit that plus sign, that BOM is going to look identical no matter what verb you're using. But the verb itself, whether it's process or sync or get, may have some different elements and attributes inside of it. And so this particular view is of a process bill of materials, and we can see action criteria inside there. And inside that action criteria, there's an action expression. And this is a really handy way to put in some more advanced processing logic from the sender and the receiver, allowing the receiver to communicate based on special actions. So what we normally do here is we paste XPath expressions into the action expression, and that allows the receiving system to know better detail about what kind of action the requester would like them to perform. Here's another example of the verb. In this particular case, we have an invoice, and it's a get invoice. And in this scenario, what we see is a set of attributes inside the get verb that allow the sender to say, I would like to see this many records, and here's a unique indicator, like a unique identifier that says I want to see this particular invoice, and you might specify that invoice's ID there. You might have a max items. You might have a record set save indicator. I want to make sure this record set is saved for future reference. A record set reference IDs. If it's already been saved, you could put the ID there in the record set reference ID. So there's a lot of power here when you start working with these get show API related features. And our 30 minutes is up. I really appreciate you all attending, and look forward to our next webinar probably in about a month and a half. Thank you, and have a fantastic day and great weekend.